Right. So most of you know me. I'm Irini Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit in the US, and our mission is to provide free resources and support especially to educators who teach Homer and ancient Greek texts and English translation, but really we want to just provide a community for talking about and keeping the classics alive for anyone who wants to engage with us. So if you have any questions, if there are any programs you'd like to suggest or request, please do feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat along with our website. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Ben Cassel. Ben is completing his PhD at King's College London. His PhD thesis explores Athenian collective memory as it is constructed through religious experience, and a chapter of his thesis relating to embodied cognition and ancient Athenian ritual dance received the George Grote Prize in Ancient History. He's currently the editor of the Journal of Cognitive Historiography. So Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Irini, and thank you for initially offering this slot to speak back at the CA in March, which it feels like 4 years ago now. And thank you all for joining, whether you're in the US or in the UK, especially for those of you in the UK. It's 5 in the evening on a Saturday, and you're about to have 45 minutes of cognitive theory thrown at you. So I'll begin. Recent years have seen an increasing application of theoretical models derived from the cognitive sciences to the study of ancient religious practice. This paper, firmly aligned with this methodology, as not only allows us to move away from simply reproducing symbolist accounts of ancient ritual, but also provides a concrete point of departure in discussing how particular experiences could elicit particular effects in participants. Here, I'm focused on 2 rituals performed by young Athenian women, the Aiora and being a Panathenaic kanephoros, and consider how these rites would have affected their cognitive states. What is indicated, I should share my PowerPoint, shouldn't I? That would be good. Luckily, we're still on the first slide, so you're not missing anything. Let's have a look. Can everyone see that?
Not at the moment. We did have, right now it just says Ben Cassel has started sharing,
Well, it's still the first slide, so I'll continue in any case. So what is indicated by this mode of analysis is a set of experiences by which abstract notions and beliefs regarding female behavior would be adopted at an embodied level, while simultaneously supporting an experience of agentic importance in the religious life of the polis. So I will begin with the kanephoroi. So as a religious role practiced across Greek antiquity, the kanephoros was responsible for carrying kana, the ritual baskets containing sacrificial tools at the head of procession. This office has been predominantly examined as a visual display of the ideal maiden that symbolized the performer's move into a state of premarital preparedness. However, while being a kanephoros is acknowledged as having been an important event in the self-image of those that performed it, how particular aspects of this religious act could affect those young women has been overlooked. As such, my aim here is to consider how these experiences afforded by being kanephoros would affect them in such a way as to allow for the adoption of wider cultural material. Here, the haptic, kinesthetic, and emotional aspects of being a kanephoros are indicated as providing the embodied and cognitive conditions essential in the adoption of moralized behavior and shared belief systems. Rather than being something of a beauty pageant, the experience of being a kanephoros allowed her to feel the physiological, emotional, and mental states of being an ideal Athenian woman. How kanephoroi are visually depicted is vital to this reconstructive analysis. In fact, they demonstrate aspects of both the prescribed and physiologically required movements demanded by this religious role. So depictions of kanephoroi first appear in Corinth in the 7th century BC and in Attica by the mid-6th century BC. As identified by Linda Rokos, from the mid-5th century, the kanephoros can be identified by her distinctive festival mantle, as well as head carrying. The well-known passage from Lysistrata underlines how being kanephoroi could be a significant milestone in the identities of those young women chosen to perform it. So in Athens, the office was thought to have been founded in the age of autochthonous kings, with the daughters of Kekrops and Erechtheus depicted as kanephoroi in visual and textual sources. Importantly, these prototypical Parthenoi are of good birth, eupatridoi. How kanephoroi were selected under democracy is more obscure. However, the provision of 100 gold ornaments during the Lycurgan period need not be taken as an indication of their number, and indeed they are only ever described or depicted in small groups. So, the physical experience of being a kanephoros. The most obvious element of being a kanephoroi was the kanephoroi's haptic and kinaesthetic experience was balancing and carrying the basket on her head. Importantly, while are the slides moving for you?
Yes.
Okay, good, because they're taking the time on my end. Okay, importantly, while various forms of ritual basket are depicted in our sources, the form particularly evident in Attic vase painting and sculpture during the late Archaic and Classical period is this lovely, elaborate three-handled container. Often dedicated as votive offerings, these ritual baskets are listed in various temple inventories where they weigh between 1,000 and 3,700 drachmas each. This weight has been used to argue that they were in fact too heavy for actual use and are simply decorative. I strongly contest this position. So 6,000 drachma amounts to around 27 kilograms, meaning a weight of between 2,000 and 4,000 drachma falls quite strikingly into the spectrum of loads carried on the head in modern cultures. That is to say, between 10 and 17 kilograms. This is also so in adolescence. As such, I argue that the baskets listed in these inventories had been used by kanephoroi, or were at least representative of real ones. So the physiotherapist, Roger Perrin, extensively studied the mechanics of the body while supporting loads on the head and head carrying as a cultural practice. He concluded that to balance weights of 15 kilograms on the head, the spine reacts in a jack-like manner and lengthens by at least 12 millimeters. Although this gain is relatively small, the postural and morphological changes are impressive, manifesting in a clearly visible gain in height. Moreover, walking with head-supported loads significantly decreases the oscillatory movements of the spine in three planes. That is to say, the spine tends to move in a more parallel plane relative to its long axis, while also preserving a vertical lengthening response to the load. In essence, head carrying is impossible to perform without achieving an ideal head-neck alignment, which both limits overall movement while making the performer appear and feel taller. Moreover, almost all depictions of kanephoroi show them balancing the basket with their hands. If this position was maintained throughout the course of the procession, which likely took up to an hour, the arms would experience a considerable amount of tiredness and even numbness. Wearing the distinctive mantle would also constitute a novel haptic experience. Depictions of this garment altered from the mid-5th century, from draping over both the front and the back to being pinned at the shoulder and falling to the feet. However, we can tell that it was still voluminous and likely made of wool, and thus quite heavy. As such, it would again contribute to lifting the posture and limiting movement, while its weight and material, wool, would assuredly contribute to feelings of being hot. Another haptic experience for the Panathenaic kanephoros would be wearing lead white makeup, which Aristophanes and Hermippus jokingly refer to as powdered wheat. So this cosmetic was derived from lead, and importantly, Theophrastus details how it was made, with a powder being produced after bricks of lead are soaked in vinegar. In fact, this method of production was followed up until the 17th century in Venice. When made with vinegar, this composition has a cooling, drying, and stiffening effect, sucking moisture from the skin. Indeed, wearing this form of cosmetic very likely constituted an unfamiliar, if not entirely new, physical sensation for these young women, with the face effectively hardening. This physical experience during the Panathenaic can be summarized as being one of constraint in movement with sensations of extra weight, heat, and a stiffening face. Balancing the basket would make the kanephorus stand and feel noticeably taller, while very likely numbing the arms. It would also demand acute attentional focus, which I'll explore below. So, embodied cognition. This experiential framework suggests several conditions by which prescribed bodily postures and movements can engender what is titled indoctrinally desired mental states in ritual participants. Embodied approaches to cognition argue that cognition emerges through an interplay between the brain, the body, and the environment. In essence, what the body does and experiences during ritual practice are vital components in how participants adopt abstract beliefs and construct their self-image in line with prevailing cultural ideals. During his analysis of happiness in the rhetoric, Aristotle described how the ideal female body is both beautiful and excellent in stature, kalos kai megathos. Now, while megathos can refer to magnanimity and greatness in a general sense, it can also be taken as stature and height. The moral attributes of the ideal female are, of course, sophrosyne and domestic productivity, criteria hardly unique to Aristotle. The philosopher goes on, as well as being beautiful, megathos, and exhibiting self-control, the ideal woman avoids miserly or a servile nature. Yeah, Aleotheria certainly refers to stinginess here, yet we should not ignore the strong connotations the word has with slavery, especially in Plato. That bad posture and stooped shoulders were considered emblematic of a servile nature, has been recently underlined by Sarah Forsdyke and may be significant here. In any case, by carrying the types of weights recorded for the baskets on their heads, the kanephoroi spine would elongate, producing a perfect head-neck alignment. In essence, they would feel themselves standing to their maximum height. So in balancing their sacred baskets, they adopted a physical posture associated with notions of ideal femininity, at least by Aristotle's definition. Moreover, while there are several images of men head carrying from Greek antiquity, this is predominantly depicted as a gendered action, most especially in the context of the fountain house. These images here are also fascinating in that they clearly show the physiological phenomena described above, with the women carrying full hydra adopting a rigid pose in comparison to that of their companions. So in standing taller, the kanephoros also adopted a pose associated with the eupatridae and aristocracy more generally. For instance, in Lysias 1029, where the wealthy are being berated for being overly beautiful but also tall. Yes. So another way movement is depicted in images of kanephoroi is in the rigid manner of their gait. Again, this would be induced due to the physical and attentional demands required of balancing the basket on their head, essentially manifesting in more deliberate and smaller steps. Obviously juxtaposed to the other figures around them, kanephoroi always look straight ahead with their heads erect. In these examples, they are part of a moving procession, yet they appear almost stationary and on a vertical plane with nearby columns. Their feet also, if you see here, are often barely separated. The physiological reality of head carrying means that the ability to look at where one is directly walking is hampered. The head is erect and weighed down. Taking small steps would come as an obvious result of this process, and a kanephoroi would assuredly not want to drop her sacred basket. Of course, walking in a delicate manner was a feminine ideal from Homer onwards. These images have been interpreted as illustrating kanephoroi in training, with the other women focusing on keeping the basket on their head. However, I believe they seem far more engaged with keeping their physical posture upright, with the shoulders back and the head held high. A sharp contrast between how these women are walking and the kanephoroi is again obvious. Balancing the kana while ascending the Acropolis would demand the adoption of movements associated with feminine sophrosyne and arete. In essence, it facilitated an embodied experience by which these ideals would be more readily incorporated into the self-image of these performing Parthenoi. A vital element here is the formula delivered to these young women: perform your task beautifully, fair one, kalai kalos. This phrase, which is repeated variously in Aristophanes, is now argued as representing a genuine ritual proclamation, given to those young women about to perform in the procession. Of course, kalos is here referring to the physical execution of carrying the basket beautifully. However, the combination assuredly operates as a simultaneous indication of moral beauty, honor, and virtue more generally, as with the description kalos kai agathos. Alongside the experience of being physically restrained, the moralizing demand to perform beautifully would have manifested through the explicit demand on expressive regulation for Athenian kanephoroi. Indeed, they adopted a serious outward appearance, with a calm exterior again aligned with the ideals relating to sophrosyne. Yet rather than an artificial display, particular aspects of the kanephoros experience suggest her as embodying this expressive suppression. The manner in which she would have to move and the attention demanded in balancing her basket would lend themselves to adopting a sedate appearance. More particularly, I suggest that the use of white lead cosmetics would only have supported this adoption of an emotionless expression, providing a sensation of dehydrating and stiffening skin. Embodied approaches to cognition argue that moral propositions, rather than being adopted simply as semantic content, actually arise through physical experience. Indeed, metaphors grounded in bodily experiences such as disgust and indeed standing at one's full height are directly employed in moral conceptualizations. This is certainly evident in ancient Greek, where orthos can refer simultaneously to physical and moral uprightness. In ritual contexts, the bodily cognitive states of practitioners can be manipulated in such a way as to engender these moral concepts being embodied in the sensory motor system. A good example being kneeling to pray and feelings of humility. The command directed at kanephoroi to perform their duties beautifully is an indication of such an intersection, with emotional calm and physical balance being inherent characteristics of the ideal moral woman, as we saw from Aristotle. At a broader level, the embodied experience of the kanephoroi is revealed as restraining the body and emotions in a manner that aligned with the perceived requirement to physically and conceptually bind women. Deliberate and focused movements, small steps, straightened back, and emotionally calm face. As Cassel notes, since women does not bind herself, she must be bounded, including through the prescription of her gestures. Rarely performed rituals, such as performing as a kanephoroi, attempt to shift participants' cognitive systems in such a way as to align them with specific conceptual frameworks and worldviews. To cause this shift, embodied experiences afforded in these rites are often dramatic, demanding, and awe-inspiring, moving participants into culturally desired mental states. Visual depictions of kanephoroi illustrate bodies in prescribed and ritually manipulated states, and while certainly idolized, they reflect the reality of carrying a basket, which required balance on both physical and emotional levels. Rather than artificially acting, these demands would constitute an embodied experience of moralized concepts of femininity. As well as aligning with the conditions by which participants embody moral and cultural concepts, the experiences I outlined above also matched a particular theoretical framework of cognitive resource depletion. And this is where you're going to have to bear with me a little bit. So while previous models failed to explain how cognitive mechanisms mediate the transmission of religious knowledge, the framework of CID proposes specific aspects of ritual experiences as affecting participants' susceptibility to collective ideas and identities. In essence, through differing demands on participants' attention, resources employed in action perception, narrative processing, and memory creation are heavily depleted. This leaves them more susceptible to authoritative interpretations and collectively constructed memories, promoting adherence to cultural ideas and beliefs while also aligning participants' recollection of what actually took place. Now, the ritual features identified as facilitating this depletion include arousing environments, demanding physiological experiences, expressive regulation, and an overt focus at the gestural level. That performing at the head of a Panathenaic procession would have constituted a sensorially and emotionally arousing context hardly needs to be emphasized. The sights and sounds that would surround the kanephoroi would likely have been overwhelming at times, while the desire to perform their task well and the expectation of their upcoming contribution to the sacrifice would be nerve-wracking and exciting emotional feelings. Simultaneously, the walk up to the Acropolis would be physically demanding, ascending in a restricted posture, arms above the head at a gradient of around 80 meters, while wearing extra clothing in the Athenian summer heat. Despite this, they were expected to remain expressionless and have a calm appearance. They were to remain galos and emotionally restricted. Artistic illustrations of the kana again provide vital details on how they would affect the attentional focus and bodily movements of kanephoroi. As already noted, the form of basket predominantly depicted in Attic sources is a three-horned tray. And while we know that the things for the sacrifice were carried in these containers, they are surprisingly shallow. Moreover, many depictions show them to be considerably wider than the head of the carrier. This would mean that rather than going straight up, their arms would be out at a wider angle. As such, balancing this form of basket would require a higher attentional demand than if it were a regular shaped container. The strong desire not to drop any of this material and the gait adopted would also contribute to their attention being given over to minute sensory motor actions and experiences, i.e. watching where you're walking. Holding the basket above the head for that amount of time, suggested for the Panathenaic procession, would inevitably cause blood circulation to slow and numbness or even pain to set in the arms. Any sign of discomfort would again have to be suppressed. The act of balancing the basket on the head beautifully would thus require a high degree of physiological, attentional, and emotional focus. While certainly presented in an ideal manner, what these visual depictions represent is a ritual act that is both demanding and potentially uncomfortable, requiring explicit attention at the haptic and kinesthetic level. The specific combination of these experiences with the demand on expressive regulation perfectly matches the framework for cognitive resource depletion. As a result, two outcomes would have been highly likely for Panathenaic kanephoroi. The first is that culturally diffused interpretations of their role in the Panathenaea would go unquestioned. In fact, their prior understanding and expectations would override subjective experience. In this instance, the knowledge that their religious duty had been founded in the autochthonous age for well-born young women would have come to the fore and framed how they perceived their own actions. The second result of this form of cognitive depletion would be that participants' memories of how and what took place during the procession would align through post-ritual discussion and guided interpretation. In effect, the memory of acting as a kanephoroi would be collectively and culturally constructed. While obviously not a personal account, the recollection of being a kanephoroi in the Lysistrata is again interesting here, with the prescribed outfit and their beautiful manner being the main highlights. Both these processes would also inherently support an experience in which the kanephoros would feel and not simply understand their vital importance in the execution of the city's sacrifice and relationship to Athena. Not only would the effects of cognitive depletion mean that the identity of the performing kanephoros would more easily merge with the figures of the autochthonous princesses, but that their own memories of the event would be aligned with wider cultural ideals as to what their actions had constituted. So, with these theoretical parameters in mind, I now move on to our second case study, that of the Aiora. This rite almost certainly took place during the Anthesteria, a festival concerned with both the opening of the new vintage and the commemoration of various episodes relating to miasmic pollution. The Aiora commemorated Erigone, who killed herself by hanging after her father Icarus was himself slain by a group of Athenians to whom he had introduced wine and then thought themselves poisoned. Before her suicide, Erigone, or Dionysus in some sources, cursed all Athenian women to suffer her own overwhelming grief and likewise hang themselves. The placation of Erigone, the lifting of the curse, and the purification of the pollution caused by the unjust murder of Icarus are all enabled via the establishment of the commemorative ritual swinging, the Aiora. Indeed, the myth emphasizes the dangers of excessive female grief, suicidal mania, and unjust killing as polis threatening miasma. An important aspect to her representation is Erigoni's desperate search for her father across Attica, which indicates her as being both mentally and physically untethered. She's titled Aletis, the Wanderer, if we follow Athenaeus' description of her commemoration during the Anthesteria. And Aletis is elsewhere ascribed to vagrants and laboured journeys. The perception of excessive female mourning as being both politically and religiously volatile in the classical period is very well established and need not be repeated here. What needs to be underlined is how the episode of Erigone firmly relates to forms of socio-religious pollution. This is especially the case with her committing suicide, which, as Plato makes clear, physically and conceptually divorces the deceased from the life of the polis. In effect, the collective evocation of Erigone during the Anthesteria touched upon intersecting forms of pollution and existential threat. As well as her own death, the curse inflicted on the women of Athens illustrates the explicit danger her commemorative placation aimed to alleviate, or rather avert. Indeed, it was seen as a potential disease. While generally argued as moving the overall festival of the Anthesteria from a state of pollution to purity, the Aiora is suggested as being somber in mood. In his summation of the Athenian Anthesteria, Callimachus notes that the third day of the festival was one of mourning for the women of Attica. Argument has been made that a state-level version of the rite may have existed, with the demon of Icarion being an obvious arena. The heroine and her father did receive joint sacrifice, at least there, and in any case, it was performed across Attica in both public and private contexts. Of course, the action of swinging also imitated the heroine's mode of death. So again, the aim of this rite was to specifically assuage a curse that, if not placated, would induce the women of Attica to a suicidal mania in replicating Erigone's own grief. In fact, it was seen as protecting its performers and women at large from suffering the same mental state. Now, consideration of this rite from the perspective of embodied cognition is particularly pertinent and actually aids in illuminating an exceptional example of bodily cognitive experience and cultural memory intersecting in Greek ritual practice. As with the kanephoroi, an embodied approach to the Aiora suggests an exceptional framework in which would again facilitate doctrinally desired mental states in its performers. Indeed, the act of swinging during the rite is suggested as being contextually understood as producing particular feelings, namely emotional calm. Moreover, it strongly suggests methods by which the performers would be socially bonded, while facilitating an adoption of abstract moral conceptualizations relating to bodily and mental purity. So the Hippocratic, are the slides still changing?
Not changing right now. We're on Ikarios and Aragon now.
There it is.
There it is.
Okay. Oh no, I feel like now it's gone on 2. There we are. We're on the right one. So the Hippocratic corpus, which we all love, don't we? Famously assigns the form of frantic state suffered by Erigone to virgins that do not take a husband and become pregnant at the appropriate time. If this is not accomplished, the result is the experience of visions, murderous distress, and an urge to strangle themselves. And I will highlight in the left-hand quote, towards the end, he says that they desire to choke themselves and have visions. So this list of symptoms finds direct unison with the distress and death of Erigone, who herself is emphasized as a virgin. Indeed, the notion of visions afflicting young women in this state finds parallel in Nonnus's description of Erigone, where she is visited by the ghost of her father. More significantly, a comparative association between such states and frenzied worship of Dionysus is underlined by Plato. Importantly, in order to alleviate such behavior, Plato specifically describes synchronized rocking and swinging accompanied by rhythmic singing. External motion, he says, thus applied, overpowers the internal motion of fear and frenzy. It brings about a manifest calm. That singing accompanied the action of swinging during the Aiora is explicitly stated by Athenaeus. Indeed, they are described as lullabies, songs titled, again, Aletis, the Wanderer, and assuredly recounted the episode of Erigone's desperate search for her father across Attica. What this demonstrates is that the ritualized swinging of the Aiora firmly aligned with the embodied and auditory conditions by which suicidal mania, especially in young women, was understood as being assuaged. Thus far from simply mimicking Erigone's mode of death, this rite is revealed as being enacted as a placatory rite that would, through its physiological experience, negate the forms of self-destructive urges suffered by the cursed prototypical women. As a physical, rock emotions have indeed been firmly identified as alleviating the impact of emotionally distressing situations and forms of hyperarousal associated with depression. Of course, at a fundamental level, exertive physical movement is also inherently uplifting owing to the release of endorphins. As such, how the body was manipulated during this rite would have enabled more positive mental states in its performers. Moreover, the intersection between the resulting effects of swinging and the verbal recitation of Erigone's story via song likewise indicates the ritual conditions which enhance the adoption of moral intuitions at an embodied level. The Aiora thus represents a startling intersection between the commemorative evocation of an Athenian cultural memory and its embodied experience. In placating the curse of Erigone, these young women performing this ritualized swinging would have more readily felt themselves as being guarded against any such mania. To these processes, it is important to underline how swinging represents a form of movement which inherently delineates and bonds ritual participants. The rhythmic nature of this rite is again underlined by the description of lullaby-like singing, while all visual depictions that have been assigned to this ritual show someone pushing the swing, thus maintaining a distinct pace. Rhythmic beats and synchronous movement activate physiological and psychological processes of emotional alignment and have been firmly identified as inducing feelings of entitativity, that is, usness, in various contexts. A primary cause of this process is argued as originated in so-called mirror neurons, which induce sensory motor cognition to align, and in ritual contexts have been shown as making all of the participants have a nice bonded feeling afterwards. Forms of ritual synchronization have been observed in various contexts, and in this case, would have aided in these young women actually feeling themselves as a defined group responsible for executing this vitally important rite. Of course, the sensation and understanding of having physically imitated Erigone's mode of death would likewise lend itself to these bonding processes. Even if not performed simultaneously, rhythmic singing and swinging still represents a form of movement that would formulate bonding between performers who are observing, anticipating, and reflecting on their having just completed an action. Indeed, in at least one visual depiction, it suggested that other maidens would have been pushing the swing. They may have also sung the aletis, which would again bring their actions of singing and swinging into rhythmic union. So the physiological experience of performing the Aiora is revealed as providing an embodied interaction with the narrative of Erigone's death and related curse, while the prominent synchronic quality would also aid in socially bonding those that did so. Furthermore, features of the rite again align with the general principles of cognitive resource depletion, thus suggesting how its experience would facilitate the adoption of abstract concepts and beliefs. In line with one of the fundamental elements of the resource depletion model, aspects of the Aiora point towards there being an expected suppression of emotional expression in its performers. Again, Plato underlines how the act of swinging, accompanied by rhythmic singing, via its exterior motion, brought about a sound state of mind, and is directly associated with regulating the corrosive effects of feeling fear. Earlier, earlier in his laws, we have a stronger association with rhythmic movement and emotional regulation. Pleasure and love, he says, and pain and hatred spring up rightly in the souls of those who are unable as yet to grasp rational account. Where other creatures are devoid of any perception of these kinds of order and disorder in movement, the gods have granted the pleasurable perception of rhythm and harmony, whereby they cause us to move. And rightly, by voice and gesture, he keeps right his feelings of pain and pleasure. Rhythmic movement is here a means by which rationality is cultivated, while one is correctly trained in feeling and expressing pleasure and pain. This description certainly finds correlation with the Aiora, where the precautionary tale of Erigone was evoked via a physical exercise deemed to assuage forms of Bacchic-like frenzy. Moreover, we should again note the description of Callimachus, who associates the Aiora with a day of lamentation, lamentable or pitiable. I contend that this choice by Callimachus, in fact, reflects a more somber tone, rather than any exertive wailing, such as we might associate with funerary contexts. While admittedly tentative, the portrayal of this rite as falling on a pitiful day points towards the ritual swinging being carried out with a degree of expressive regulation. Athanasius' description of the Aiora also points towards a more sedate setting due to the form of lullaby-like singing. Most obviously, in a rite where the aim was to placate the threat of emotionally dangerous states, the notion that there would be an expected expressive regulation is quite obvious. Again, this expectation, if coupled with physiological and emotional arousal, would cause the forms of cognitive resource depletion noted earlier. But how far can we consider swinging as a logically arousing? Indeed, as I have underlined, it conforms to methods by which rationality and calm were perceived as being cultivated, while the songs are described as relaxing. However, its overtly synchronic nature does indeed point to an exertive experience. We may gain a possible insight into the emotionally arousing aspects of this rite from this Attic red figure Kos, dated to the third quarter of the 5th century BC. Here, an adult man rests a crowned youth on a swing with a seated, veiled figure observing the scene to the right. To the left of the swing, and the central figure of the male adult, a young woman clings to a youth while gazing intently at a swing. This scene has been variously interpreted as illustrating the preparation for the Aiora, with the gesture and pose of the Parthenos here indicating a trepidatious approach to the swing, i.e. fear. So taken together, the evidence suggests an experiential framework in line with ritual features identified as causing cognitive depletion. The action of commemorating Erigone would have provided a physiological, psychological, and emotional experience in which this cultural memory would be evoked and transmitted via the bodies of its performers. Moreover, the embodied evocation of this episode would be supported via features that produce cognitive resource depletion. While we cannot confirm the presence of any religious authority within this ritual, authoritative suggestions and pre-installed knowledge would dominate subjective experience. So while the imitative nature of the rite would certainly align with what the performers knew of Erigone and her death, such features such as the wandering songs that were sung during the swinging represent a startling example of verbally narrating a commemorated event during Greek ritual. So to conclude, by examining ritual through a consideration of its embodied experience and impact on particular cognitive processes, we afforded new perspectives as to its formative potential on the identities and beliefs of its practitioners. In the case of Panathenaic kanephoroi, the physical realities of head carrying would demand particular states and would support an experience of gendered and moralized movement, standing erect and taking small deliberate steps. In being limited in their movements and emotional expression, these Parthenoi would have practiced and not simply displayed the cultural ideal of mental and bodily self-control. Simultaneously, this expressive suppression, when coupled with the arousing and exhausting realities of being a kanephoros, would mean they're being more susceptible to adopting authoritative interpretations of their duties. This includes how they would recall the event itself. Similar processes are also evident in the rite of the Aiora, where a somber tone accompanied a rhythmic and likely fast physical movement. Indeed, this ritual environment is indicated as producing an embodied cognitive experience by which its performers would have adopted desired mental states and abstract beliefs relating to correct female behavior. Importantly, and rather than being a simple commemoration, the imitation of Erigoni's suicide via swinging would have produced a physiological experience that would have induced its performers into a calmer, more positive state. Indeed, it was understood as doing so. As such, these young women would have been induced to feel and express the ideal emotional state for premarital parthenoi. Likewise, synchronized movement and singing would aid in producing feelings of entitativity, thus delineating and bonding the performers as a particular group. Indeed, what is also revealed in adopting a consideration of the cognitive effects of these rituals is how they would have inherently supported intense feelings of being important to the religious life and health of the polis. For kanephoroi, the resulting effects of head carrying would mean their subjective experience would align with their understanding that the office they were performing again was originally done by the autochthonous princesses. Likewise, for performers of the Aiora, the understanding that they were responsible for continuing the alleviation of Erigoni's curse would be reinforced by the bonding effects of synchronized movement and cognitive resource depletion. The experience of these rites would have facilitated an interaction with abstract notions of ideal female behavior, emotion, and mental states as at an embodied cognitive level. At the same time, these experiences would have generated a fundamental understanding of their importance to the religious health of the polis and in the self-concepts of these young women. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow, that's great. That's exactly, that's what came up in the chat as well. Linda mentioned like walking with books on one's head to improve posture.
Yes. I'm going to just change tabs and stop sharing.
Right. And I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can chat. Again, just the recording. I am not ending the meeting. So,